Hi, everybody. On behalf of Michael Barham, William Lutz, I would like to welcome all of you to a new webinar that is part of a series based on the 7th editions of the Bergin and Garfield Handbook of Psychotherapy and Behavior Change. Reflecting the really broad influence of the handbook, this series is jointly sponsored by 3 organizations: Society for Psychotherapy Research, SPR, Society for the Exploration of Psychotherapy Integration, SEPI, and the Society for the Advancement of Psychotherapy, which is the Division 29 of the American Psychological Associations. The series will run into the spring of 2024 and will involve 10 webinars covering most of the chapters of the handbook. We're doing this because we want to remind students, clinicians, and/or researchers that the handbook is providing a broad and in-depth review of the major issues related to psychological therapies that have been empirically investigated. Michael, Wolfgang, and I are biased, of course, but we believe that if there are questions that you want to know about that are related to if, how, for whom, by whom, and under what conditions psychotherapy works or failed to do so, you should consult the handbook because it has been the premier reference for research since 1971. We also hope that the webinar series will entice everybody who has not done so yet to buy it, knowing that all the proceeds are going to SPR. The series officially began in March 2023, and 3 webinars took place during that spring. One on the combinations of psychotherapy and medications by Steve Holland, one on quantitative methods to investigate psychotherapy by Scott Baldwin and Simon Goldberg, and one on training and supervision by Clara Hill and Sarah Knox. It's also important to mention that a preamble of this series took place when Michael, Wolfgang, and I had the opportunity of giving a webinar sponsored by SPR with Alan Bergin, who was with Sol Goldfried, the co-editor of the first 4 editions of the handbook, really started this major traditions, and Michael Landberg, who actually took the baton for the 5th and the 6th editions. This, in our eyes, was a very important moment in the history of the handbook and psychotherapy research. Fortunately, this, as well as the 3 other past webinars, have been recorded and they are posted on the SPR website. We are happy to let you know that other webinars are already been scheduled. On October 17, Heidi Levitt, John McLeod, and Bill Stahl will be presenting on qualitative research. And on November 13, Mary Beth Connolly Gibbons and Bruce Wampel will be talking about the process, outcome research, and the therapist effect. Today, we're very fortunate to have major figures of 3 theoretical orientations. Each of them, in my view, have frequently been victim of empirical ignorance. That is, the belief that some of their main constructs and interventions are either not falsifiable and or have not generated enough or much research. As indicated by the title, this webinar, as well as the 3 chapters that they are based on, should set the record straight. The webinar will be lasting 90 minutes and involve 4 segments, 3 given by each of the presenters respectively, and then 1 segment for discussions among all of us. So we will have Robert Elliot, who will be talking about humanistic and experiential psychotherapy, Jacques Barber to talk about research on dynamic therapies, and Myrna Friedlander will be talking about systemic couples and family therapies. Without further ado, I'm now inviting Robert to take the microphone.
Thank you very much, Louis. I'm going to set you're going to give me a 5-minute warning when I'm at 15 minutes. Is that right?
Absolutely.
Thank you. Okay. So it's a rather intimidating proposition to try to present something that took 18 months of my life. And I've just noticed that my slides have this annoying transition thing going on with them, which I'm going to have to delete that. Okay, that's fine. Okay, let's start that over again. Okay, anyway, there it is still. Okay. Anyway, so this is the reference, as we said. This represents 18 months of my life when I was living in Scotland. I've just, in the last few months, moved back from Scotland to the United States. I now live in Northern California. The aim of this talk is to summarize or present highlights from the most recent update of a series of substantial reviews of research on humanistic experiential psychotherapies, or HEPs, I'm going to call them. This chapter updates covering the period 2009 to 2018. The chapter is actually a set of reviews. Here I'm going to focus on the most important one, which is the outcome meta-analysis. The chapter also has a meta-synthesis of qualitative outcome research, as qualitative analysis of helpful and difficult aspects of therapy, and research on specific therapeutic tasks and client change processes. It concludes with a synthesis of the research with implications for practice and training. And I'm just going to scratch the surface here today, so I recommend the rest of the chapter to you. Okay, so this represents the most recent episode of what I call the Humanistic Experiential Psychotherapy Meta-Analysis Project that goes back to 1992-93. In preparation for this talk, I listened to Steve Holland's wonderful presentation from last March, sort of, chronicling the history of his encounter, his interaction with the handbook. And, I have similar experiences, well, not as illustrious as his, but so in any case, in 1992, Les Greenberg and Germain Littard and I undertook to do a meta-analysis of all research on humanistic experiential psychotherapies. We had a series of kind of misadventures with Saul Garfield, who didn't want us to be in the book and challenged us, and but we eventually made it through with a much better product than we would have done if we hadn't been challenged. So this is the summary of the generations of this meta-analysis project, and particularly noting the explosion of research on humanistic experiential psychotherapies from the 37 we reviewed, and it was published in 1994 in the 4th edition of Garfield and Bergin, to the 191 studies we had in the 2013 edition, 6th edition, then this one, we added another 91 studies. So huge amount of research. It took us, as I said, 18 months of our lives to do this work. The design of the meta-analysis is a systematic, inclusive, quantitative meta-analysis with 3 lines of quantitative outcome evidence. I like to, think about converging lines of evidence. So there's pre-post effects, effectiveness studies, there's controlled effects, efficacy studies versus no treatment, and there's comparative studies versus other therapies that aren't humanistic experiential therapies, most commonly CBT. And I'm really interested in the convergent divergence among the lines of evidence. I apologize, I'm talking quickly, but I don't have much time. So I used, in this analysis, we used, over the years, we've continually updated our meta-analytic techniques. We used independent judges for the final selection studies, audited all study analyses, constructed a Prisma diagram, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera, weighted effects by inverse error, random effects models, all these kind of things, looking at both main and moderator variable effects. And we're also going to compare these results to our previous inclusive meta-analysis dating up to 2008. So an exhaustive search, we attempted to find all existing studies. This is the selection criteria, had to be labeled as one of the brands, or described explicitly as empathic or centering on client experience, and at least 2 sessions, at least 10 clients, adults or adolescents, 12 or older, and we had to be able to calculate a Cohen's d. And this is our Prisma diagram. See, we have a Prisma diagram. Started with 32,000 studies, ended up with 91. And now this thing turned on again. Okay. And this is the types of humanistic experiential therapies we were looking at. Person-centered therapy, PCT, represented 40% in the 2008 sample and 21% in this sample. Supportive non-directive therapies, which is the villain in this story. These are primarily carried out by CBT researchers as control groups, and they represent 1/3 of our sample in our update here. EFT studies, 17 to 20% in both samples. Gestalt psychodrama, again, around 20% in other experientials. So there's the kind of humanistic therapies, the lengths of therapies. I'm just going to skip past this slide here. So the first line of evidence: how much do clients change over the course of receiving humanistic experiential psychotherapies? This is documenting the amount of pre-post change, which is, I think, a scientifically interesting but largely overlooked question in the literature. These are uncontrolled studies. You can't make strong causal inferences. However, pre-post change is a first condition for causal inference. No change, no causal inference, right? No causality. Also, pre-post studies are of practical importance, and they allow us to make the widest use of widest range of evidence, including new and emerging client populations and approaches. So this is a big old table of the pre-post effects. I'm just going to give you the highlights here. We have in the middle of the table here the previous meta-analysis of the 191 studies, and this is the update in the right three columns. And so this is primary outcomes, all outcomes. We get effect size of 0.93 in the 2000 up to 2008 sample, and 0.73, a little bit smaller in the 2009 to 18 sample. And then these effects tend to be maintained out through follow-ups pretty consistently or slightly larger. And if you break them out by the type of humanistic experiential therapy, we've got person-centered around 0.95, 0.98, so strong effects pre-post. In the person-centered emotion-focused therapy tends to be a bit bigger, 1.2 effect standard deviation units, 1.3 in the new sample, and the other ones are in there someplace. Okay, so these are the main approaches, the findings for the main approaches. Second line of evidence: are humanistic experiential therapies more effective than no therapy? These are controlled studies against waitlist controls or no treatment controls, and we can use these to make causal inferences. Do HCPs cause clients to change, or as we prefer in the humanistic therapies to say, do clients use these therapies to cause themselves to change? And then this is just the effect size. We're coding. If the HCPs are better outcomes, it's positive. If it's worse, it's negative. Okay, so these are now moving into the control and comparative analyses. And these are the controlled effects. And so in the up to 2008 sample, we have 62 controlled effects overall. Half of them RCTs. RCT status or not makes no difference in any of my results here. We get about 3/4 of a standard deviation. That's controlling for the change in the no treatment conditions. In the new sample, the effects are bigger, actually. They're 0.88, 0.98, depending on the controlled studies have slightly larger effects. And these are just the breaking out the untreated and HEP pre-post. These are the pre-post effects. And these effects here, the controlled, are differences in change in HEPs versus the untreated clients. So those are the controlled effects. So we find pretty large effects, controlled effects, that enables us to make causal inferences. The third line of evidence: are other therapies more effective than HEPs? Most people in our culture assume that CBT is more effective than other therapies, including HEP, psychodynamic, systemic, the other folks that are here today. Is this true, or is it a myth? Well, that's, of course, the question, right, isn't it? So in the previous meta-analysis, or all of the comparative studies with 135 comparisons, 13,000 clients, we got a zero difference, zero comparative effect size, so no difference. That's a strong equivalence finding. This value is statistically significantly smaller than, a tenth of a standard deviation effect size. In the more recent sample with 63 comparisons, 16,000 clients, we have an effect size of -0.08, which is essentially zero order. RCTs only, we get basically the same results. Again, whether it's RCT or not makes no difference in terms of the effect sizes. And so that's the overall effects. But of course, folks want to know, how do HEPs stack up against CBT? And so this slide shows the two meta-analyses, the older one and the current one, recent one. So HEPs versus other therapies that are not HEPs, but are also not CBT. So overall effects there, we get, small effects slightly favoring humanistic therapies in both of the older meta-analysis and the newer one. So we have consistency across the two meta-analyses with the confidence intervals there in parentheses. But now the comparison everyone's interested in is person-centered versus CBT. It's 22 comparisons, 7,000 clients. In the older meta-analysis, we had a minus 0.06. Again, an equivalence finding. In the more recent sample with 10 studies, we've got a minus 31. So that is large enough in favor of CBT that we're saying that there might be a slight superiority to CBT in the more recent studies. And that's going to be the central question in our discussion here of this, I think, going forward. The supportive non-directive therapies always do worse than CBT. Here's our previous meta-analysis, minus 31 with 37 studies. Here's the current one, minus 31. Consistently across all the analyses I've done, supportive non-directively consistently is outperformed by CBT. And one of the conclusions we draw from this study is like, don't do supportive non-directive therapies. They're not very effective. Finally, at the bottom there, we have 15 studies that compared more process guiding or more intensive HEPs to less process guiding. That's like EFT versus person-centered. EFT is more process guiding, more intensive, and person-centered. And so there's small effects favoring the more process guiding HEPs, but these are not statistically significantly different. So they're sort of equivocal findings. Okay, let's see, how am I doing for time here? 12 minutes, okay. These are equivalence analyses. I'm going to skip over the equivalence analyses for lack of time. This just looks at what client problems do HEPs do best and worst at. And in the current meta-analysis, we find that the depression has nice pre-post effects, habit, substance misuse, anxiety, total sample, relationship issues. But we find there's a consistent finding across the different meta-analyses that these therapies do less well with anxiety presentations. And in this analysis, slightly less well with depression. Now, in the previous meta-analysis, this is the 2000 sample up to 2008, we found no difference for depression, a strong effect for psychosis in the comparative effect sizes. And again, we find this poor showing against anxiety. So I'm just going to leave it at that for now. The conclusions of this are that the recent meta-analysis largely replicated the previous results with an independent sample of new recent studies. And these therapies, especially, including PCT and EFT, appear to be effective. HEPs didn't do as well in the 2019 samples, and we think it's because of overwhelming CBT researcher allegiance. The researcher allegiance problems gotten worse in the more recent studies. Let's skip through that. Overall, maybe in this data set, CBT might have a small advantage over HEPs. This is similar to the finding of the practice trial that Michael Barkham and his team recently produced. I'm just going to kind of skip ahead here because I'm running out of time. Let me just see how I do this without being too chaotic. All right, so client presentations. Best results for humanistic-experiential therapies with interpersonal relationship problems and trauma, but not if it's supportive non-directive approaches. Surprisingly good showing for working with chronic medical conditions. It's an under-recognized possibility for humanistic therapies. We find evidence for use with value with habitual self-damaging activities like substance misuse and eating difficulties. It's not just motivational interviewing. It seems to be comparable to motivational interviewing effects. We consider motivational interviewing to be a humanistic therapy, but it's not in this meta-analysis because there were just too damn many motivational interviewing studies for us to review. interesting in both meta-analyses, helping clients cope with psychosis, small samples, but consistently surprisingly good results over both meta-analyses. Mixed results, effects for depression, consistently poor results for anxiety, but none of these studies involve EFT, the sort of new humanistic therapies now being applied to anxiety. So those are some of the main.
You have about 5 minutes, Robert.
Thank you. Yeah, Louis, that's fine. Okay. So conclusions, obviously more research is needed, especially collaborations with folks from other approaches so we can achieve balanced research allegiance in studies. Quantitative research can be our friend, along with qualitative and case study research. But, I think research evidence not enough. We need to network and lobby. We need to develop our own networks and structures, and especially have representation on guideline development groups. All right. I'm just waving the meta-analysis of qualitative outcome research here. That's reviewed in the chapter. And this is the synthesis of research on 5 key client change processes in HEPs, including narrative processes, simulation of problematic experiences, emotional expression, emotional transformation research. Very, very interesting research, but don't have time to go into it today. And this is just more about those sort of recommendations. I mean, one of the things that, I think, we concluded this chapter, as we did the previous review chapter, that the neglect of HEPs and training programs and treatment guidelines is not warranted. These therapies should generally be offered in postgraduate trainings and internships as an alternative to CBT, especially as treatments for depression, interpersonal difficulties, coping with chronic medical conditions, self-damaging activities, and psychosis. Like CBT, HEPs are evidence-based for a wide range of client presenting problems and are therefore need to be included in the education of psychotherapists. So that's my main kind of rush through this. And I showed you a picture of me on the slopes of Ben Lomond in Scotland. This is now a view of Mount Diablo, a mountain that I can see, every day as I walk down my driveway where I live in Northern California. So thank you very much for your attention, and I'm going to stop here. Okay.
Many thanks, Robert. Many thanks. So let's open to a period of question here, specifically about Robert's very inspiring presentation. And you don't need to hit to use the chat. Just
so Heidi, looks like you got your hand up.
Hi.
Hi, good to see you. Always good to see you.
Good to see you. Good to see you. I had 2 questions. I guess I'm assuming that you controlled for researcher allegiance.
I've done it now. So we measured researcher allegiance, but in the new meta-analysis, the researcher allegiances in the comparative studies are so skewed, you can't statistically control. If 90% or whatever it is, 80 or 90% of the researchers have a negative researcher allegiance to humanistic therapies, you cannot statistically control for it.
I see. So that's really important to be clear on. The other question I had was, did you run analyses on more process-focused HEP studies versus CBT, like just isolating the more process-focused ones, or EFT, or?
Yeah, the recent sample doesn't have, I'm trying to think if they've got any studies comparing. There was basically no CBT versus EFT comparative studies in that 10-year period we reviewed here. Those studies have since appeared since 2018, but in this meta-analysis, it's before that wave of studies began to appear in press. So we don't have that in the new meta-analysis.
I see. Do you know from what the new ones are? Just curious for if you have an update.
Not really. No.
Okay.
No, I haven't done that yet.
Thank you.
Yeah, I mean we're redoing. We're in the currently in the middle of redoing an EFT specific meta-analysis. Jason Charbonnet from Australia is leading on that, so we'll have that in that analysis.
That would be awesome. Thank you.
Mm-hmm. Other questions? one of the interesting things that, Michael's practice trial results came out while this sort of after this chapter was, when it was practically about to be published, and we stuck a little bit about it. But Michael, that the practice trial found that, at 6-month follow-up, the person-centered was, equivalent to CBT. There's no difference. But at 12-month follow-up, the CBT had pulled ahead. It wasn't that the people in the person-centered had gotten worse. It's that the CBT, there's a lot of change between 6 and 12-month follow-ups. And right now there's a group of us which are, we're trying to persuade Michael and his team to let us get our hands on some of the data so we can look at what happened between 6 and 12 months in that study, because it's really, really interesting. Okay.
Yeah, I mean, can I just kind of respond? Yeah. Because I suppose both at a specific level and at a kind of research strategy level, the whole thing about is one therapy better than another therapy, I don't know, it kind of gets us that far, really. Yeah. What I found particularly exciting with folk in Sheffield is drilling down into the practice trial, because it, as you sort of presented your results, the practice trial seems to summarize the overall findings on it. So it becomes a really neat kind of singular entity for analyzing what's going on. And one effect that we've become aware of, which actually we published on in an independent study, and a colleague, Kerry Arden, has done some brilliant work on this, is we found actually what we call a crossover effect. So that is that when we look at CBT and person-centered experiential therapy over time, that actually, when we drill down to it, and it's not in the Lancet Psychiatry paper, that actually person-centered experiential actually has an advantage early on. So it's not just that it's equivalent, it's actually an advantage. But that actually then you get this crossover effect, and then CBT the results favor CBT. So that actually there's something about how the two therapies are actually impacting at different points in time. And that actually maybe that has implications for service delivery, or the type of problem that people are presenting with, whatever. So, I think there are some exciting approaches there that actually look at each respective therapy of where each of them is working best, and therefore would be best for patients or people in need. And I suppose what I'm trying to say is I think that approach is slightly more rewarding than pitching one therapy de facto against another therapy de facto in that kind of way. So, we're all interested and keen on the collaboration, Robert.
Sure, great. I know not take any much more time before we pass on to I think Jacques is next, but I think in EFT we consistently find lots of changes in the last part of therapy. So between the sort of the 6 and 12 month period, for therapy that goes maybe 20 sessions or something, there's the EFT will be the same as person-centered, and then it'll pull ahead. So there's some kind of effect that happens late in therapy. So it's another one of those temporal effects, I think, that's going to be really interesting to dig into in the future. So with that, I think I'll yield the floor to the next presentation. Thanks very much.
We still have a little bit of time. I'm wondering, Michael, just if you could just remind people or briefly summarize, what was that trial that you conducted?
Practice trial. It was basically comparing CBT with person-centered experiential. And from a research design point of view, it's a trial embedded within what is used to be called the IAP system. So basically, there were 500 sort of patients enrolled into the study. But again, what is equally interesting is that embedded trial, we also have contemporaneous data on everybody who was outside the trial. So we can actually compare findings from within the trial compared with people who were not in the trial but received the service as normal in that way. So in other words, it's a really good example of how a trial is embedded in a practice orientated setting in that kind of way. So it bridges evidence-based practice and practice-based evidence. But anyway, that's what's being written on at the moment. So, but you know, it's an exciting trial. Anyway, you can read it in the Lancet Psychiatry. It's a very terse outcome, but it's interesting.
Thank you. I saw somebody raise his hand a few seconds ago. I don't know if that person.
Michael, I'd love to get my hands on that other study you just mentioned in talking to in your discussion, right? So okay.
Yeah, we'll to and fro on it. Don't worry.
Oh, here we go, Jerry. So Jerry, you have a question.
Hi, yes. I'm a master's student, so some of this is above my head. But I was curious about that meta-analysis that you did. And I was wondering, what was the sample? Was it from a US patients or was it a global patients? I was curious if cultural differences affects effectiveness of therapy.
Right. So we did, we had samples from all over the world and we analyzed that. And I don't even if we report it because we have so much data, but I don't remember finding any differences between the samples in different parts of the world, especially, now East Asia is coming online, right, with research. Yeah.
Great. Thank you. Thank you, Robert.
Welcome.
Jacques, you have the microphone.
Thank you. Can you see my slide now? No. I'm wondering if you're seeing my slides. No.
Yep, now we see it.
Okay, let me see if I can do it like this. Which one do you see now?
We see beautiful pictures of beautiful people.
Okay. All right.
Louis, you're showing us the speaker view right now.
Yeah, okay. So I'm
Not
trying
Louis,
to
Jacques, I mean, Jacques.
Yeah, thank you. Anyway, I'm not succeeding at doing that. So let's do it like that. Okay, sorry about this. So my name is Jacques Barber, and I will speak. So I have two comments to start. One is that I want to thank Louis, Michael, and Wolfgang for inviting us to write a second edition of our chapter. And also I want to apologize to my friends who have heard me recently, because my talk is going to be very similar to what happened in the past, to what I've said in the past. So this is a chapter we wrote, and really the work was done by Chris Moran, Kevin McCarthy, Jack Keefe, and Sigal Silra-Mano. That's a kind of a quote. So I'm quoting myself from a previous edition of that chapter. And I think it's a pretty important message that that I'm trying to convey. So one psychoanalysis of psychodynamic rules the earth. Unlike the dinosaurs, they did not disappear, but rather sprouted many variations and new offspring. To those offsprings have forgotten everything about their origins. So when we speak about psychodynamic therapies, we're really speaking about a family of therapies. And in our chapter, we didn't really distinguish between the different kind of therapies within the psychodynamic tradition. The problem with that is that, of course, as in all families, there are degrees of divergence and agreement, and to quite a large extent. Why should we care about psychodynamic psychotherapy? Sorry. Before that, what did we mean by psychodynamic psychotherapy? We tried to find some common themes that are common across the different form of dynamic psychotherapy. Of course, the focus on unconscious processes, the focus on affect, cognition, and wishes, less guidance, use of open-ended questions, and of course, the consideration of transference and countertransference.
Jacques, could you share your screen? I know we were having trouble with the view, but it would help us, especially the non-English speakers, if we could at least see even the
We don't see your
presenter.
slides now.
I think even the speaker version would be okay.
Would be
if
okay,
you have
yeah,
problems, yeah.
Yeah. Uh-huh.
So I'm a bit confused. What is it that you see from me? Just me?
Just you, yeah, not
Okay.
the slides. Just share the slides again, those.
Yeah, okay. Do you see them now?
Yeah.
Yep.
Okay. All right. I'm sorry. I thought I did that earlier.
Mm-hmm.
And I apologize for my voice. I think many of you will need to increase your volume. So there's not much I can do about this at this point. Why should we care about psychodynamic psychotherapy? I think there are many reasons, and I've listed them here. It's really a very important base background of all the psychotherapies that are today, or most of them. It's also very pervasive in the cultures. We can speak about Freudian mistakes and stuff like that. What I find always most interesting is that therapists from different persuasions are likely to go to psychodynamic psychotherapy for their own treatments. What I'm going to focus on today is speaking a lot about the evidence, a bit like what Barber did before. So when we look at the evidence of dynamic psychotherapy, we focus on randomized clinical trials. And I'm always, I've stopped being astonished by that a lot of psychotherapy researchers have a very negative view of randomized clinical trials. And I wanted to do a survey whether the pandemic has changed the view of randomized clinical trials among clinicians and among researchers. I think the main reason for that is because, for me, when there was all these issues about what the medications we should use for Corona or for COVID, or what kind of treatment should we use and what should we test our vaccination, that was quite incredible to me that so many people were mentioning things that were not really valid and not based on randomized clinical trials. I have written extensively about some of the limitations of randomized clinical trial. I will not mention that too much today. But I think at this point, if we want to show that the treatment is efficacious, this is really the best way for us to do that. So it's a bit like democracy. Randomized clinical trials are not perfect. And it has been said that democracy is the worst form of government, except all those other forms that have been tried from time to time. And this is so critical today when we see what's happening in the world about the erosion of democracy around the world, and about randomized clinical trials and about science. All right, let's speak about depression. As you know, depression is very prevalent, and it is a very expensive burden for everyone. So where I'm presenting it is I've created this drawing. This is a comparison of psychodynamic psychotherapy versus control at the end of treatment. These are all the studies that we did in the meta-analysis, where we use basically many of the things that Robert really mentioned earlier, and I'm not going to go into that. What we found is that when you compare dynamic psychotherapy for depression versus control condition of many kinds, the effect size is 0.6, which is a very medium to large effect size. We also compare dynamic psychotherapy to other active treatment. Most of them are psychotherapies, but because few studies have medication, I just speak about it as active treatment. what you see is that there is absolutely no difference between dynamic psychotherapy and other active treatment at termination. Effect size of 0.01. We didn't do that in this last chapter, but I wanted to show that to you because we did that in the previous chapter that was published in 2013. We asked the question, does adding psychodynamic psychotherapy to medication, is that helpful? And we had found back then 3 studies. And what they show is that if you add psychodynamic psychotherapy to psychotherapy, if you add psychodynamic psychotherapy to medication, patients are doing much better than if they get medication alone. I think it's a very important finding, and I hope it will be studied more extensively. That's a difference, that's the same thing. So as Robert was mentioning, there is a lot of controversy about the use of non-CBT for anxiety disorders. And we have been doing over the last few years, a series of meta-analysis on this topic. And Jacques, who was a student of mine and now is a faculty in New York, has been really leading the field in that regard. So if I speak about psychodynamic versus control, what we found is an effect size of 0.94, which is a very large effect size. This is a between group effect size, by the way. And maybe we can have a discussion later about within group effect size versus between group effect size. These are all the studies that compare dynamic psychotherapy to control condition. And this is a comparison of dynamic psychotherapy versus active treatment. Many of them are CBT conditions, and I don't really have a separate slide for just dynamic psychotherapy, just CBT. But what you see is that the effect size is 0.01, indicating no difference between dynamic psychotherapy and active treatment for anxiety disorders. Unfortunately, there is not enough studies to study that for specific disorders. I think in the next few years, we'll have enough in panic to do that. There is some indication that in GAD, we may not be doing as well as CBT. But outside of GAD, we're speaking about panic, there is no difference. This is looking at long-term, at short-term follow-up. As you see, it's a non-significant difference comparing dynamic psychotherapy to active treatments. This is long-term follow-up, and again, it's a non-significant difference between dynamic psychotherapy and active treatment. Not many studies. So let me speak a little bit about personality disorder. We did the same thing as we've done for the depression and anxiety. And really what we found is really, when we look at the efficacy of dynamic psychotherapy versus control condition, the effect size is 0.6, suggesting that dynamic psychotherapy is more effective than control condition. When we compare dynamic psychotherapy to other active treatment, for example, you remember the study from Shelley McBain with a SPR member. Therefore, there is absolutely no significant differences between dynamic psychotherapy and other active treatment. Short-term follow-up. Sorry. I must say that I'm very embarrassed that I could not arrange the show the way it should be, but anyway, that's what happens. This is dynamic psychotherapy versus active treatment for the short-term follow-up. And as you see, there is a non-significant differences. And the effect size is 0.07. So basically, I think what we have shown is that overall, if you compare dynamic psychotherapy to control conditions for depression, anxiety disorders, and personality disorders, there is absolutely no difference between, there is a significant improvement following dynamic psychotherapies and following control condition. For active treatment, there is absolutely no difference between dynamic psychotherapy and active treatment as far as we were able to see. Let's speak a little bit about borderline personality disorder. As you know, there's a lot of interest in borderline personality disorder. And I don't really have the data, I don't have direct data, but overall it has been shown that psychotherapy in general is more effective than control condition for borderline personality disorder. This is a summary that Christea did a few years ago, and she was nice enough to look at the dynamic psychotherapy within a sample, and she found that dynamic psychotherapy was more effective than control condition for the treatment of borderline personality disorder. I need to update that. So basically, you know, that's what we found. One of the points I want to make is that there is a lot of interest in research on dynamic psychotherapy in the last few decades, in contrast to the time before that. And there are things that are in progress that are very interesting. So for example, people are looking at the effect of dynamic psychotherapy for DSM-5 personality disorder criteria. There is some work on separation anxiety disorder. And what's most important, I think, is this idea that psychodynamic psychotherapy should be tested for PTSD, especially complex PTSD. Not enough studies of that. And I think people had given up on non-CBT and non-exposure treatment for PTSD. But if you work at the VA or if you read the literature, you find out that CBT is helpful. It's helpful for some patients. It's far from being helpful to all patients.
Jacques, you have approximately 5 minutes. That is,
yeah, it's okay.
For 15 minutes now.
It's fine. And there is some work done on transdiagnostic model of short-term dynamic psychotherapy. And there is even work on dynamic psychotherapy via the internet that has been going on that has been shown pretty effective. I think some of the future directions is really more the work that I have done, some other people have done, which is really to look at what patients' characteristics are best for different treatment. So there are some characteristics that are good for some patients, that are good for some treatment, and maybe others. Another direction is patients who didn't respond to prior treatment. So if you may want to study patients who have not done well with CBT for PTSD, let's say, on depression, and see if there is something we can do to help them. An area that I've done some work on is really looking at the efficacy of dynamic psychotherapy for ethnic minority. And as maybe some of you know, we have shown in one study in a post-hoc analysis that dynamic psychotherapy was more effective than medication and placebo for African-American male. So there is some interesting, that has not been replicated, unfortunately. And of course, it has to be replicated more by other people. And of course, what's most important is understanding the better the process of therapy. So I'll speak a little bit, I don't have much time. And the chapter is spending a lot of time on the mechanism and moderators. But an important distinction that I want you to keep in mind is the distinction between intervention and mechanism of change. Intervention is what the therapist does. Mechanism of change is something that is most likely in the mind of the patient and that we are targeting. Keep that in mind, as that will really help you avoid a lot of confusion in psychotherapy research. So I just want to speak about the work that Kevin McCarthy did. He was a co-author. And as you know, we had published a meta-analysis about 10 years ago showing that adherence and competence of therapists have nothing to do with outcome. One of the thoughts we had is that the relationship between adherence and competence and outcome is not linear. And so we have assumed, and we have some findings showing that the nonlinear relationship really is what driving the process. So in this work, Kevin was really trying to deal with this basic idea, which I think is a pretty American idea, that more is better. But there are some clinicians that think that too much intervention can be destabilizing. So we were thinking about looking at something such as a Goldilocks effect. And so what he found in a sample of depressed patients that received dynamic psychotherapy, using a method called the multi, he found that is when you look at the amount of psychodynamic psychotherapy intervention that is being done, he found that too little interventions, there was little improvement. And when there were a moderate amount of interventions, there was the most improvement of the patient. So I think I'm going to stop here. And I have more to say about the process, but I think that's enough. And I hope you can read the chapter and hear it from. So thank you very much for your time. I apologize about the slides.
Many thanks, Jacques. And the slide came in, we enjoyed them even more. So thank you.
Thank you.
Let's open the questions here. I think Wolfgang, you have a question.
Actually, I did just clap, but
Yes.
Okay, sorry.
Just want to
Sorry.
say thank you, Jacques, for this for the talk and yeah, but I can ask a question though. You asked me. It also already started a little bit with Robert's this presentation, and I'm maybe we have that over now several generations of the handbook. We have like chapters on humanistic, systemic is a little bit new, but psychodynamic, and they show all that we have effects here. But when we look to the different countries, so we have all regulations which are very, very different. So the treatments are very, very heterogeneous. So within countries, also between countries, also in terms of treatment length. I'm coming from Germany, where we have really strong legislation. Treatment approaches are fixed by law and can't be combined, for example. And there's quite some new debate now going on. What should be taught actually for students? And I'm wondering, and in some way, this is also already a question to Mickey. Do you have suggestions where you say, well, something like this, no matter what the regulations are in what country, what would be good that students use or learn in when they have clinical training, no matter what, from your specific perspectives?
I think an interesting question is what sequence of treatment we should teach our students. And I think maybe Louis has some ideas about that, but the question, for example, is should we start people on dynamic psychotherapy and then teach them CBT and then dynamic psychotherapy? Should we go to Clara Hill, helping skills and dynamic psychotherapy and then CBT? Or Clara Hill, helping skill, CBT and then dynamic psychotherapy, just as an example. I think that's a very interesting question. And I think people should do some study on that. And we can maybe tell us what's already known.
Well, I don't know. I think Clara, by the way, is here, so maybe she could help out. But I mean, it's a very interesting empirical question, Jacques. I think a priori, though, I at least in my writing, what I emphasize is that the first step is that the therapists, especially in North America, are systematically and competently trained in at least 3, if not 4, conceptual model, and that they are then invited at some point in their career to choose what they find the most comfortable intellectually, personally. And I think that's a major faux pas that we're making, that we're restricting the systematic training to typically one form of orientations.
Yeah.
And then people later on will be using other informations, but the training it may not be as systematic and not as long as they receive in grad school.
Yeah.
Would that be also the view from you, Jacques, Robert, and Heidi? Is that Mickey? Sorry, just so. Yeah.
I mean, it's quite clear that in a lot of programs in America, they're teaching mostly CBT. That's what's happening in de facto.
I mean, I can say that in the US, there's almost no humanistic people teaching in clinical psych PhD programs. I think there's me and Barry Farber. I think that's it. So it's really dire, and I don't see research coming out looking to see if people who have training across orientations do better than as therapists than people who don't have training across orientations or who only have one approach. I think that we're really missing evidence on that. I also think, what Robert was saying was really alarming me in terms of that we keep funding, more and more approaches that are CBT driven, and we don't have tons of RCTs coming out for people to look at. That's really alarming in terms of how we're disseminating research funding. And I wonder if there's ways to communicate with NIH or funding bodies about, we have a lot of evidence that some approaches work, and we need to target money and funds to be able to produce evidence to answer some of these questions, because otherwise they're just disappear. These diversity in theoretical orientation is just disappearing. Right?
Yeah, absolutely. You're right, and the NIH has no interest in that.
Yeah, I know. For the other thing I was going to say just quickly is that I know Robert mentioned the idea of getting people involved in clinical practice guideline groups. I think that the people in this meeting would be the people who would be, strong candidates for being involved in those sorts of groups. I know you're all really needed in terms of being able to shape how we think about what research is, and think about that in complex ways across theoretical orientation.
Yeah. So Les Greenberg and I were in the guideline for depression, and so it was 7 years of hard work.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I know.
Yeah.
We need it still.
Yeah.
But maybe
I
not
know.
from you specifically. You've done your duty.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Coming back to the question of having many trainings and what order, would anybody like to comment on perhaps checking out the weightings of effect, which was really, really interesting just a few minutes ago, that different therapies, their effects become weighted in different ways over time. So might it be but I'm just speaking from a training institute perspective, and I don't have an answer or a suggestion to what it might be, but might a criterion be to start treatment with the therapy that has the most immediate effects, and continue with medium-term and long-term effects therapies, but also using the same criteria for how to stage out the training of the therapists themselves. So for them to get started and get positive feedback, and for their professional self-efficacy to develop, it would be useful for budding therapists to start with whatever seems to produce quick results, and then add possibly more robust or more systems, techniques for longer term stuff. I mean, how does that sound? I don't have an answer as to what those would be in any particular order.
That's a good question, but I'm also worried about Mickey's time.
Sorry.
Great question. Maybe we should come back But it's also very important to keep in mind that it may be that some of the interventions that take a longer time to be more effective actually takes a longer time per se to actually conduct. So it may be that their effect, in order to be there, you need to conduct it for a longer period of time. But great question. We should come back. Robert is right. This is the time for Mickey. Mickey, you have the microphone.
Yeah, thank you. Let me see here. Thank you for your attendance at this webinar and for your interest in systemic therapy. I wanted to thank the editors, the 3 editors, for inviting us to do this massive project, and also to recognize my co-authors, Lori Hetherington and Gary Diamond. So I didn't do what Jacques and Robert did by pulling out some of the pearls from their chapter. Instead, I just pretty much outlined the chapter for you. And I didn't put any citations in my slides, figuring if you're interested, you could find them all in the outline. So it's kind of interesting. We had a back and forth, Louis and I, probably with Michael and Wolfgang, about the title of our chapter. It being systemic therapy. They wanted systemic therapies. I said, what about couple and family? And we settled on systemic and conjoint couple and family therapy, because there is no consensus about what the term is. It tends to be used interchangeably with both theoretically and in terms of a modality. But generally speaking, systemic therapies, whether it's with individuals, with couples, with families, or even people that are not related to one another, the point is to modify the recursive dynamics in subsystems that sustain individual and relational problems and distress. So in addition to couple and family therapy, systemic therapy can refer to individual therapy with a systemic conceptualization, where no family members are invited. Family therapy with an individual, Murray Bowen popularized that, or conjoint therapy with family members who are sort of partners or coaches of the therapist in trying to reduce an individual's symptoms. So we only focused on systemic CFT literature between 2011 and 2018, looking at efficacy, uncontrolled outcome studies, and where my heart is, effective change processes. And you can see what we excluded, because this is massive. It's really a massive amount of literature. So basically, it's not news that couple therapy works. Previous handbooks found success rates comparable to individual therapy, like the other ones, larger effect sizes for RCTs than for effectiveness studies. Most recent reviewers pointed to couple distress and relatively new focus on intimate partner violence and infidelity. And also couple therapy for individual distress related to alcoholism, drug abuse, depression, cancer, PTSD. But most of the couple treatment is based on the link between unhappy romantic relationships and mental disorders. The 2 most frequently researched with follow-up studies are in the cognitive behavioral realm, CBCT, and integrative behavioral couple therapy, and secondarily emotionally focused couple therapy, which has much more process research. Outcomes, usually level of relational distress or satisfaction. People also have looked at commitment, quality, status, like whether people get divorced in follow-up, individual functioning as a result of couple therapy, and the burden on partners, or how partners cope. Moderators are inconsistent. Interestingly, you'll see in the slides that people that are more distressed tend to do better, and with higher levels of dysfunction, including accommodation to the partner's PTSD symptoms. In EFCT, partners that have more emotional control coming into the therapy do better, and in CBT, partners that are more distressed, the partners in couples therapy do better in CBCT. Change processes, as I said, more in emotionally focused, looking at events, sessions, or outcomes, blame or softening interventions, resolution of injuries like infidelity, forgiveness, and compared to individual therapies, I think that family therapies in general, there's greater therapist activity in more effective cases, more emotional presence, validation, reframing, and interpretation. And interestingly, EFCT is hindered by therapist passivity. In the cognitive behavioral realm, greater emotional closeness is an important change process and a positive change in the quality of communication. We've long known that family therapy works, robust support for high quality studies, individual and meta-analyses. Some approaches are thoroughly researched, by others have received minimal attention. Most frequent have been externalizing disorders, conduct, delinquency, ADHD, substance use. The next most frequently studied are internalizing disorders, OCD, anxiety, depression, eating disorders. Interestingly, what I think is really important and what, I don't know what the percentage is of people that come to family therapy that don't have a diagnosable disorder, but have very challenging family problems. They're infrequently studied, and I think this is because the grant funders are not interested in non-disorders for outcome research. But there have been more studies of challenging family problems in recent years, such as gang involvement, sexually transmitted infections, runaway youth, juvenile sex offenders, and unrelenting anger toward a parent. So in terms of the youth with externalizing disorders, several meta-analyses, significant but more modest effect sizes when compared to individual group psychodynamic, but large effect sizes compared to no treatment. So the most research approaches are the four listed here: FFT, MST, MDFT, and BSFT. Particularly strong for systemic treatments of substance use. There is some cross-fertilization, which is interesting, that focusing on, for example, an adolescent with marijuana use, family functioning improves, including reductions in parental alcohol use and sibling antisocial behavior. Moderators mostly studied in MDFT, multidimensional family therapy, effective kind of across the board, particularly for youth with more severe substance use and more disruptive behavior. So these couple and family therapies do well with people that are on the more severe end. More effective for youth under 15 in multisystemic therapy, and more effective with therapist adherence. In terms of internalizing disorders, OCD has been studied recently, predominantly CBT-based, targeting the family accommodation with family-based therapy or adjunctive therapy, moderators, parental involvement, family cohesion, and when there's less parental blame and conflict, the youth do better. Anxiety, including social and separation, predominantly CBT. Family-based might be less effective than individual CBT if the parents are highly anxious. You might have heard of PCIT, parent-child interaction therapy, has been shown to be effective for very young children. And again, moderators, parental involvement, although that's mixed. On the depression spectrum, with self-harm and suicidality, attachment-based family therapy has been shown to be superior to enhanced care. Also, adjunctive family interventions with CBT and functional family therapy. For self-harm, a focus on family interactions or other sources of support, very few moderators. In terms of eating disorders, the leading approach is FBT, family-based treatment, also called MAUDSLEY, more effective than individual therapy for anorexia, with reduced hospitalization, but modest support for bulimia. There are fewer studies, but increasing support, and mixed results for using it with systemic family therapy. Better for clients that have more severe eating pathology, better with adolescents than adults. Anorexia is better when the parents are warm and less critical. I imagine everything is better with warm parents. Bulimia is better with less conflictual families. There have been recently family therapy for adult disorders, particularly impressive evidence for the serious mental illness, growing evidence for depression, but the studies haven't been huge. Family psychoeducation, you've probably heard of this, focusing on the neurological bases of schizophrenia and social interaction, effective in reducing relapse and rehospitalization, improving functioning, quality of life. Interesting, promising research on avoiding the first episode of when you have prodromal symptoms. Family-focused therapy for bipolar disorder, and the moderator is families with more negative emotion. So my heart is really in change processes. So we only looked at effective ones, not just what happens in the therapy, but what happens that's effective. Changes in family functioning, particularly for youth with externalizing disorder, what change processes are helpful. Bringing the family, having more cohesion, more effective parenting, better communication, less conflict. For internalizing disorders, less expressed emotion, that's negative emotion. Less accommodation to the symptoms, in other words, doing what the person wants you to do. Decreased parental control and greater autonomy. In-session changes in family therapy, more productive emotional processing when therapy is effective, more use of systemic techniques by the therapist, enactments and reframing, and more collaboration. So we did look at systemic individual therapies. The most researched approaches, mainly in Germany, as Wolfgang was talking about what countries want. We only looked at the ones that are also used frequently with family therapy. So postmodern, solution-focused, narrative, and brief strategic. We only found 4 studies, but 3 of them compared brief strategic therapy for social phobia and found that it was most effective for clients without a personality disconnect. Not surprising. So the change process that's most common is the alliance. Meta-analytic effect size is pretty robust. We didn't find differences for couple versus family based on the therapist's characteristics, the type of approach, or the type of problem. There are a few studies of rupture and repair of alliance. The moderators are the age of the client, the gender, referral source, whether it's self-referred or mandated, the type and timing of the alliance measure. The shared alliance with the therapist or among the family members, which is called the within-system alliance, is more predictive of outcome than any individual client alliance with a therapist. And worse outcomes when the alliances between the family members with the therapist are unbalanced, where, for example, one person really likes the therapist and one or others don't. Very important to have therapists joining and parental involvement and support. So we also looked at what have we learned in the last in those 8 years of our chapter. There's been a broader range of problems, more international studies, more community studies, even RCTs, more comparisons to individual CBT or psychodynamic, very few studies of individual systemic compared to a lot of clinical literature about it. Couple therapy, more studies of adherence, more follow-up studies, finding that differences due to treatment tend to dissipate over time, more lasting effects for approaches that focus on partner acceptance, understanding, and responsiveness, like to the depressed partner or the partner with OCD, for example. In couple therapy, more studies of PTSD for medical concerns, more integration of knowledge with principles of individual therapy, more studies of adherence or integrity, more studies of relational concerns that don't have to do with a disorder, more studies of emotionally focused therapy, especially change process. In family therapy, more large-scale effectiveness research, new populations such as gang-involved youth, risky sexual behavior, more study of substance abuse, international, cost-effective, more assimilating systemic concepts and techniques into CBT approaches, and more studies of reluctant youth. Cultural factors, more diverse samples for established therapies, more international studies. There are a few moderator studies of race or ethnicity, but we've seen more cultural adaptations of treatments. In terms of moderators, anxious and avoidant attachment is a big one. Partner accommodation, as I mentioned, history of childhood abuse, type and features of diagnostic variables, and family communication early in therapy. In terms of the change process research, alliance studies continue to predominate, but we saw more studies about faltering or problematic alliances, more treatment-specific change mechanisms, more studies of trying to look at the direction of does individual functioning improve relational functioning or vice versa.
Mickey, about 5
minutes.
minutes.
Sure, I'll get there. Fewer studies of family negativity and more studies of emotional processing compared to previous reviews, and more studies of communication between clients and therapists. We looked at how the methodology is advanced, more complex designs like multi-level modeling, therapist differences, meta-analyses, more dyadic analyses, which are very important, particularly in couple therapy, to assess whether the influence process is unidirectional or bidirectional, more testing of mediators and moderators, more testing of the reciprocal influence of individual and relational functioning, more small sample single case studies, for example, task analyses, more qualitative analyses, and more use of technology. So what we did was we looked at, I think there were 4 or 5 previous authors who had written about principles of change in couple and family therapy. And we integrated those with ours. And we came up with principles related to developing and maintaining a therapeutic stance, which is being warm, genuine, and informal. A balanced therapeutic alliance among different family members so that it's not split. Nurturing a shared sense of purpose within the family, which is absolutely critical, that everybody be on the same page about being there, how they see the problems, how they see the goals, and whether they think therapy is the way to go to address those problems, and expressing optimism. But then we came up with a lot of principles of change related to actually facilitating the change once there's a therapeutic alliance built. Respecting diversity, working with individuals or subsystems, in other words, not always having the family together, but trying to get people to collaborate, maybe by being empathic with an individual client first. Strengthening boundaries, trying to change family members' emotional experiences of one another. Involve other people as resources or supports. So on the cognitive side, trying to help people consider alternative or constructive attributions for each other's behavior. Be very direct about dysfunctional or destructive behavior, like partner violence, for example, child abuse. Increase clients' emotional attachments to another. Be very sensitive when family members feel blamed by each other. Teach effective problem solving and compromise skills. And with couples, the attachment orientation. You have to work both sides toward the middle. When you have one person who's highly anxious and one person who's highly avoidant, you try to reduce the hyperactive activation in the more anxious person and enhance the emotional availability of the more avoidant partner. So it's a bit of a dance. So we have recommendations for future studies. You probably could have figured this out from what we have said before, and my voice is diminishing, and you've sat through a lot. So I just will encourage you to read the chapter for that, and also for our methodological recommendations. One thing in particular, more and more people are using multi-level modeling, but they're not reporting the percent of variability due to couples or families. And one of my students just headed up, Eddie Orlowski just headed up a study that will be hopefully published soon, that found that actually more variability was due to the couple that reported on the alliance than the individual. It's very interesting. So we need systemic analyses and more small sample research. Thank you for your kind attention.
Thank you very much, Mickey. Very insightful, like the two previous presentations. Very inspiring. Thank you. We have a few more minutes for discussions among all of us, including among the presenters. So let's open this up.
Louis, can I jump in here?
Absolutely, Stan.
I'm quite intrigued, Jacques, by the finding you reported from Kevin McCarthy about what is the right amount of time in therapy. It's a question I've been interested in for a long time. So in the study, it sounded like, well, something is too short and something is too long, and then there's just right, the Goldilocks effect. Could you tell us what the ranges are of number of sessions of each of those parameters?
So I'm sorry, Stan, you must have misunderstood me. He didn't speak about the amount of time, he spoke about the amount of interventions that were made during this treatment.
The amount of interventions.
Yes.
Oh, I see.
So,
Okay, so that has to do with interventions, not with the time factor.
Not with
Sorry.
the time.
Okay.
Sorry.
Thank you.
I'm a bit worried about that, but thank you.
I have a question.
Yes.
I wanted to ask the editors, Louis and Wolfgang and Michael, this section of the handbook, which is very, very impressive, and every chapter, and we heard today 3 very strong presentations of the chapters, but do you have any experience of what this particular section in the handbook, what, as you Americans say, is the take-home message? If someone really sits down and reads the chapter about the major approaches, if there is one, of course not one, many more, but because that's a very important part of the handbook every time, the major approaches. I hope this is a fair question.
It's a fair question. It's a tough question. I can tell you, Adas, that we took a stab to it in the last chapter of the handbook that fortunately there were many authors, including Zagal, who's here today, and Catherine and Eubanks and Marianne Krauss and Shigeru, because like he was there also, several authors that contribute. And I think the message is, look, there's enough evidence for the four major theoretical orientations. Enough evidence to say we cannot ignore it. We cannot ignore any of those in terms of training policies and clinical policies and health policies. And I think, you know, I'd like Michael to elaborate on that. That's more clearly of his ideas, at least my interpretation of his idea, which is what essentially that does is that we now have many types of interventions. We have now a portfolio or repertoire of interventions that are effective. So rather than thinking exclusively of what is the most effective, is here we are. We have a number of type of interventions that deserve to be systematically trained, exposed to in the training, because clients in the whole world should actually be benefiting from a diversity of approach that have shown to have empirical support. So that's my take of it. Curious to see what Michael and Wolfgang think about that.
I'll just take my 2 penneth worth, which is, I mean, I agree to an extent, which is basically, I think, the more evidence we can generate collectively that provides patient choice, I think is all well and good. My only caveat that I'll put in is actually I have some reservations about a protective stance to the theoretical models. You know, I think they should be evidence-driven and not kind of protected purely for themselves, irrespective in that kind of sense. So there may be a handbook in X years' time that actually doesn't present these models in this way. And maybe that's a signal that we've moved beyond single theoretical models towards some other. I'm just flying that by in the sense that actually I don't think these theoretical models stay the same. They all have to move forward. And, you know, and so, but Wolfgang should have a say as well.
Well, I feel a little bit, I mean, I think this question from Hadas is just excellent, because I asked exactly this question myself a couple of times during the whole process. When I thought about the different editions and the chapters related to the approaches, and it's clear what would be the outcome, because everybody, so I think it's nice to have like such really experienced researchers in this area, so that we not come into a direction where we say psychotherapy research is just only promoting an approach, so just doing RCTs to promote your own approach. I think that's a little bit an issue which is tricky for our field if we develop in the future in this direction, and in some way I think that's that might become a problem. So I think it would be interesting to see. That was my question before, also to Jacques and Robert and Mickey. I mean, in terms of how could we say there is something which every student or the most students should learn, because we have such a heterogeneity across within the different treatment approaches, and we have that heterogeneity between countries, and they have all kinds of very, very different regulations, and I think that there is an issue here. Where is the progress in this field? I completely agree, Hadas. I think that's an excellent question. Yeah.
Okay, thank you. The answers are very thoughtful.
Let's go for one more question. It's already 1:31, but Peter, you have a questions there. I see your hands up.
You
may
mute.
be mute. Okay. You may be muted.
Sorry. Might we be moving towards accepting that different therapists might be better at different therapies, and how therapists end up as CBT or systemic may have something to do with where they're going to be most effective? Or is it just arbitrary? People drop into a training by accident and that's what they get taught to infuse about. Is there any research on this issue? I'll put my hand down.
This is a question for Mickey, is it?
Or is it a question for everybody?
I think it's a question for everybody, right? Yeah.
It's interesting to me that nobody has mentioned the word integration in an hour and a half.
Yeah.
Whereas I believe there have been some surveys showing that most therapists will say they're integrative, or that they draw from 2 or 3 different theories. I have to say that in counseling psychology, we do not, the majority of programs do not focus super heavily on CBT, but our philosophy is more help students develop a style of their own, or an approach that fits with who they are and the type of client that they're seeing, taking into account all kinds of integrative models, such as stages of change and Larry Butler's systemic approach and principles of change. And it's probably a lot more difficult for our students to find their way. than to just enter a program and know that it's an EFT program or a CFT program, a CBT program. So I think in the 2015 article that Laurie Hetherington spearheaded, called "The Narrowing of Theoretical Orientations in Clinical Psychology," we did a sort of a head count between clinical and counseling and saw quite a vast difference in terms of how theory is approached in the two specialties. And I'm interested in systemic therapy, but I got to say that like most of the research, I don't know actually whether that's true, but quite a lot of research is conducted, particularly change process research, by non-psychologists, people in the family science and the marital and family therapy disciplines. And systemic family therapy is not taught in a lot of US programs, including my own. It's not a requirement.
Well, it's 1:34, so we've been at it for more than 90 minutes. I'm sure that we could talk for more and more time, and that's why the SPR meeting and the CEPI meetings and the APA meetings are all for. So hopefully we'll continue these discussions, and that the handbook will continue to influence the field as demonstrated by these three wonderful speakers today. So I want to thank everybody, but especially Jacques, Nikki, and Robert. A fantastic job. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Thank you.
And we'll see you in October.